Hello. I did have something else planned for this week, but current events have made this somewhat relevant, so I brought it forward. In this video, I want to talk about this man, and to a lesser extent, this statue. I think it's fair to say that most people in Bridgewater have only a vague idea, beyond the name of the statue, of who he is. So why bring up 17th century Blake on a channel ostensibly about a 19th century cemetery? Mainly because it was these people who put up this statue. Most of them would have been aware of who Blake was, and the statue is a celebration of that. But this video will also serve as a neat preface for this next batch of videos on Bridgewater, the cemetery, and the sea. This will be a very quick run-through of who Blake was and why he's important to Bridgewater. This will only be a summary, and some of this will of course be oversimplified and lots of things will be left out. If you want to learn more afterwards, I've left a full reading list in the description below, so you can find out more for yourself. First, who was Blake? Robert Blake was a soldier in the civil wars of the 1640s, then a naval commander afterwards, and he thoroughly reformed the fighting navy of this country. He was a Puritan and a Presbyterian, meaning he wanted a pure church ruled by committees, to put it simply, and he was a Republican. He didn't like kings. So what did Blake do? Blake fought for Parliament during the civil wars against King Charles I. Blake was fighting against what he saw as the tyranny of a despotic king. He became a celebrity for his furious and stubborn defence of Lyme and then Taunton. His side won the First Civil War, but he did not take part in the trial and execution of King Charles, and he did not take any part in the Second Civil War. After the Second Civil War, Blake was considered a safe pair of hands to trust part of the navy to. He mopped up the remaining royalists at sea, first chasing Prince Rupert, King Charles's nephew, to Kinsale in Ireland and then Lisbon, and then he captured the Scilly Isles and Jersey from some royalist holdouts. During the First Anglo-Dutch War, Blake was in command of the English fleet and he won several battles, but then he lost one at Dungeness. After he lost that battle, and a bit before and after, he thoroughly reformed the navy and wrote a book of how it should be managed, the Fighting Instructions. Then he won more battles and his colleagues ultimately won the war. Blake was then given a fleet to sail to the Mediterranean to conduct diplomacy for England at the command of its now total ruler, Oliver Cromwell. Although this mission didn't achieve much directly, while he was there, Blake went beyond his brief to attack some corsairs in North Africa to try and free some captured English sailors. Blake failed in this, but he destroyed a large number of ships in the process with little cost to his own fleet. While Blake was in the Mediterranean, Cromwell had picked a fight with Spain and another war started. Blake was sent to blockade Spain with the aim of capturing the Spanish treasure fleets that were inbound from South America. Blake led a raid on Santa Cruz de Tenerife and destroyed a large Spanish fleet in the harbour in the process without losing any of his own ships. This was a stunning victory, although he didn't get the treasure. He now sailed for home, stopping off to successfully negotiate the release of all English slaves from the Bay of Tunis, but died within sight of Plymouth on his way home. Blake wanted to be buried simply at home, but Cromwell used Blake's great popularity to distract from his own unpopularity and gave him a state funeral in Westminster Abbey. So what? Is Blake worth remembering? Good question. To quote a respected local historian, as a local boy done good, I think so. This man from Bridgewater went on to change the world, and I've always thought he is a good example for anyone growing up that, through hard work and determination, you can succeed even if you're from somewhere like Bridgewater. He's also quite a good example of someone finding their calling at an advanced age. The Civil Wars broke out when he was in his 40s, and his success in the Navy was in his 50s. However, when we consider the things he achieved and the things he was fighting for, they are perhaps less relevant to today. In religion, he was a committed Presbyterian, and his ambitions for his church being adopted throughout Britain were thwarted by the religious chaos unleashed by the Civil Wars. Blake had fought very hard for a cause he believed in, that of a Republican Commonwealth, but that had collapsed into a more or less dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell, and even then kings came back in 1660, and the new king dug Blake up and buried him in a pit. Blake's reforms of the Navy, of supply, structure and command, led, a couple of generations after his death, to British supremacy in the Age of Sail and beyond. This was massively important to the Victorians, but since 1945 the fundamental centrality of the Navy to national life has slipped away. Also, the strong navy Blake led itself to empire, and this is controversial, but how far you can pin that on Blake is open to debate. So many of the things Blake achieved, and many of the things he represented, are less relevant today. Don't get me wrong, they're interesting, but this lack of immediate relevance to a 21st century audience are perhaps some of the reasons more people don't know who Blake was and what he did. What was his connection to Bridgewater? Blake was born here. He grew up here, he went to school here, and he lived here for quite a while. He was the town's Member of Parliament, and even after his fighting career took off, he was partially in charge of rebuilding here after the Civil War, and he left money to the town after he died. Was he an admiral? Strictly, no. Technically, yes. General at sea was more or less the same job. He's been referred to as an admiral for a couple of centuries now, so even if he never was one in his own day, the title is stuck. Bad points? Well, these are sort of good and bad. In the younger part of his career, Blake was brave to the point of recklessness. He thought the spirits and morale of his men were more important than powerful defences, and this was key to his defence of Lyme and Taunton. In his early sea battles, his strategy was no more than to charge headlong at the enemy, and this was skillfully used against him at the Battle of Dungeness by the Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp, who was a far better tactician. In the latter part of his career, he learned his lesson, and his recklessness gave way to caution, to the point he became surly and authoritarian in his command, although he was respected by his men and he got results, as Santa Cruz demonstrates. This latter stage, where passion for what he was doing turned to a cold resignation towards professionalism, also ties into a sad jadiness you can sense in Blake in his later years. He was an idealist during the Civil War, but while he first served a cause of high ideals, Parliament and then the Commonwealth, by the end of his life this had turned into the personal rule of Oliver Cromwell, who became king in all but name. Blake hadn't signed up for this, but he did continue to serve Cromwell and his government, and so, some might say, he bears some guilt by association. Blake saw himself as protecting his country and explicitly said, in relation to Cromwell's takeover, that he now just wanted to stay out of politics. While in Ireland, Cromwell was complicit in massacres and displacing the Irish population, and he is still hated there today. But we can contrast Cromwell to Blake. For example, after Blake had captured the Scilly Isles from the Royalists, not only was he lenient to the garrison there, but he also gave them all a lift home. Obviously, there is a fair difference between the two contexts, but Blake seems to have showed this sort of humanity throughout his career. A very important point is that Blake was not part of Cromwell's land campaign in Ireland and flatly refused a promotion to do so. For him, at the time, his enemy was still Prince Rupert locked up in Kinsale, not the Irish Catholics. I would argue Blake was sufficiently distant from Cromwell, even if he did serve him, and you can make up your own mind and remember that further reading is in the description below. So what about the Bridgewater statue? Our statue was raised partially as a local celebration of civic pride, i.e. we wanted to show off how great we were, celebrating a son of the borough. Part of a wider celebration of the town's connections to the sea, which was still very strong at the time, and to celebrate the Royal Navy. And I think, in Bridgewater, there is still a lot in Blake's character worth celebrating today. While being conscious of his flaws and compromises, we can admire his younger idealism, his sheer will of personality, or his later professionalism. His is an utterly fascinating story, and the statue on the Cornhill captures this drama. Finally, what is he pointing at? The sea. That's it, the sea, nothing else. The sculptor said when the statue was unveiled that he was pointing towards the sea, and that's it. Case closed. So that's it for today. Next week we'll move on to Bridgewater and the River Parrett, and in the meantime I shall leave you with some pictures taken by the volunteers of the Friends of the Cemetery who have now been able to return to the site, subject to social distancing of course, and you can see the work they're getting up to. So as always, you can support the Friends in the usual way, support the channel, become a member and buy one of our books, and until next time, wishing you all the best.